Okay everyone, welcome back. This is Chapter 13's lecture video, and in this lecture video we're going to cover the spinal cord as well as the spinal nerves. Now I always like to start with this picture because this picture shows the nervous system. Coming from someone who's dissected on a human body before, this must have taken ages to pull out of the body. Now, on top of this picture just being interesting altogether, we can actually see the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system on this picture. We can see the brain and the spinal cord projecting down this way, and off of the brain and the spinal cord will be all of these peripheral nerves that can be found making up the peripheral nervous system. So what we're going to be focusing in on today is the spinal cord, and we're going to learn what the function of the spinal cord is and what its structures are. So the first big function of the spinal cord is to produce different reflexes for our body. Many of our different reflexes come from neuronal pathways that can be found in the spinal cord. The spinal cord, being part of the central nervous system, serves another big function to take information to the brain and to transport information out of the brain. So the spinal cord serves as the major liaison in our body between the brain and the rest of the peripheral nerves. We'll see that the spinal cord carries both sensory impulses and motor impulses. So the spinal cord is a major highway by which certain information can make it up to the brain and certain information can travel out of the brain. So we're going to start with the anatomy of the spinal cord, and we're eventually going to make our way to the function of the spinal cord, and we're going to learn about reflex arcs. Reflex arcs will have components that will help transfer sensory information into the spinal cord and produce some type of response to that sensory information. And then we'll finish this presentation by discussing some specific reflexes that we see housed within the spinal cord. So I'll start by mentioning that the spinal cord projects from a structure on the brain known as the medulla oblongata. We're going to learn about the medulla oblongata in Chapter 14, which will be the next lecture video, but for right now, you just need to understand that the spinal cord projects from the brain. The spinal cord is going to travel through the foramen magnum and enter into the vertebral canal, where it will be protected and start protruding spinal nerves on either side. The spinal cord is going to travel down the vertebral canal, and it's going to terminate at the beginning of the lumbar vertebrae, so L1, L2. So it's important to mention that the spinal cord does not actually travel through the entirety of the vertebral canal. It's actually going to stop up here at the level of L1, L2, and then there's going to be a space for other spinal nerves to travel for the rest of the vertebral canal. You can also see on this slide that we have different nerve plexi that are coming off of the spinal cord on either side, and we will touch on these a little bit later. But for right now, we want to get an idea of the structure of the spinal cord. And that will give us some idea of what the spinal cord's function is. So in this slide, we see the spinal cord's protective structures. The spinal cord, being part of the central nervous system, is a very, very higher order part of our bodies. And it's vital that we can keep the spinal cord protected from external damage. So there's lots of different protective layers that are going to wrap around the spinal cord and provide the protection that we need for this very fragile organ. So there's three major layers. We have bones that wrap around our spinal cord on the outside. These are our vertebrae bones. Remember, the vertebrae form the vertebral foramen, and through that foramen, we see the spinal cord projecting. So this is one hard layer that's protecting the spinal cord. But we also have some connective tissue and some fluid in there as well that's going to be also protecting our spinal cord. So the connective tissue layers we have are the meninges, and we'll talk about those on the next slide. But there's three connective tissue layers that make up the meninges. We have the dura mater, we have the arachnoid mater, and we have the pia mater. And each of these are connective tissue layers that has different characteristics, but they will serve a protective function for the spinal cord as well. And then we'll find cerebrospinal fluid as well protecting the spinal cord. And this fluid is cushioning the spinal cord in case the spinal cord moves around. It can slow down its movements and offer it another layer of protection. So again, the spinal cord, being part of the central nervous system, is an extremely important organ. This is how all of the information can leave our brains and make it out to our bodies. So it's important that we have different layers that can protect the spinal cord from damage that could potentially occur. So this slide will further explain the connective tissue layers known as the meninges. As I just mentioned, we have three connective tissue layers. We have an outer dura mater, we have a middle arachnoid mater, and we have an inner pia mater. Each of these layers of connective tissue will wrap around the spinal cord and offer it a different layer of protection. And these are also listed superficial to deep. So the dura mater is going to be on the outside, the outer dura mater. The arachnoid mater is going to be found between the dura mater and the pia mater. And then the pia mater is going to be contacting the spinal cord itself. So we can actually see this outer thick dura mater shown out here. The dura mater is the thickest, most toughest layer of all three of these. We'll also find the arachnoid mater laying inside of that. You can see this pinkish or purplish layer in here. That's going to be the arachnoid mater. And on the inside of the arachnoid mater, we'll see the pia mater that actually lines the spinal cord itself. So the pia mater actually contacts the tissue making up the spinal cord. One of the other things that we can see about the spinal cord on this picture is that on either side we're projecting spinal nerves. So there's going to be different pairs of spinal nerves at different levels, and those are going to project off of the spinal cord. Each spinal nerve is going to carry sensory and motor information, and I'll cover this in a little bit more detail as we go a little further. But you can see as we go from the pia mater actually contacts the spinal cord itself. However, the pia mater is not sealed to the arachnoid mater. There's actually going to be a subarachnoid space found below the arachnoid mater and above the pia mater. So the subarachnoid space sits between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. And then above the arachnoid mater, we'll find the subdural space. So the arachnoid is not going to be sealed to the dura mater either. There's going to be a little space there also. So that's going to be the subdural space. So the subdural space is found between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater. Now the dura mater of the spinal cord is not going to be fused to the bone. There's actually going to be a space between the dura mater and the vertebrae as well, and we call that the epidural space. And this is, in fact, the space by which we're going to administer epidurals. So these are the three layers of meninges. Now we're also going to see these when we go over the brain in chapter 14. And these layers of the meninges are pretty much the same. There are some minute differences in the brain, but for now, this is what I want you to understand about the meninges. Now, as the spinal cord projects, it's going to terminate at the level of L1, L2. And when the spinal cord reaches its end, it's actually going to taper off into this pointy structure known as the conus medullaris. So the conus medullaris is shown right at the base of the spinal cord. I always like the way that the conus medullaris was named because the spinal cord makes a little cone as it tapers and comes to a point. And I also mentioned in a previous slide that while the spinal cord is going to terminate at L1, L2, there's going to be lots of different spinal nerves that are actually projecting and forming this bundle. This bundle of spinal nerves that's found beyond the conus medullaris is known as the cauda equina. And in Latin, cauda equina means horse's tail because this looks sort of like a horse's tail with all these spinal nerves sort of bunched together. So you can see up in this picture, we have the spinal cord terminating. This is the conus medullaris. However, the meningeal layers are actually going to continue down the rest of the spinal cord. We'll find our epidurals entering into the epidural space, and we'll also see these layers of meninges that are stretching all the way down the rest of the vertebral canal. So that should about sum up the macroscopic anatomy of the spinal cord. Now we're going to go into the microscopic anatomy of the spinal cord and the different structures that we see at a much smaller level. So I did mention very briefly in a previous lecture video that the spinal cord is going to have gray matter in the center and white matter on the outside. And this is different as it's found in the brain. And I will mention this again in chapter 14 because that's a very important concept to understand. However, we have gray matter that's found at the core in the spinal cord, and it makes this butterfly shape. And this is, of course, named because it's gray. That's why we call it gray matter. White matter on the outside is named because it is white, and it's this stuff found on the outside. So in the spinal cord, our gray matter is going to be found in the center, and our white matter is going to be found on the outside. And in the brain, our gray matter is going to be found on the outside, and our white matter is going to be found on the inside. So there's different structures in both the gray matter and the white matter. So let's go over the gray matter first. As I mentioned, the gray matter sort of represents a butterfly. You can see this butterfly shape that's shown here depicted by this gray matter. Now, the gray matter is divided up into different horns. We have an anterior, a posterior, and a lateral horn that we will find in the gray matter. So this is the posterior side of our spinal cord, and this is the anterior side. So this projection of gray matter back here is known as the posterior gray horn, because this is the location where the gray matter is going to stick out. Up here in the front, we have the anterior gray horn, so that's going to be found right here. And over here on the side, we'll have the lateral gray horn. The lateral horn tends to be a little bit more difficult to see. It's a little smaller than our anterior and our posterior gray horn. But as we look at this gray matter, it's important for us to remember that gray matter is made up of neuronal cell bodies. So on the inside of the spinal cord is where we're going to find the cell bodies of our neurons. Now in the center of the spinal cord, we're going to have the central canal. This is going to be lined by those ependymal cells, which are the epithelial cells of the nervous system. And this will also contain cerebrospinal fluid. We'll have our anterior median fissure, which is just this separation between the right and the left sides of the spinal cord. This is one way that we can identify which side of the spinal cord that we're looking at. This very pronounced fissure right here in the front is the anterior median fissure, and it's found on the anterior side. In the back, we're also going to have an invagination, but this is not going to be as pronounced as the anterior median fissure, and so we'll call this the posterior median sulcus. Now the gray matter is made up of the posterior gray horns, the lateral gray horns, and the anterior gray horns, and both of these regions on either side of the spinal cord is connected by the gray commissure. But as for the white matter, if we can remember, white matter is made up of myelinated axons. The axons of our neurons are projecting out into this white matter, and so this is where we find our ascending and descending tracts. So we separate the white matter into different columns. We have an anterior, a posterior, and a lateral white column. So up here, we can see the anterior white columns. This is going to be an anterior white column, and we'll have one over here as well. We'll have the two lateral white columns on either side over here. And then we'll find the posterior white columns that are found towards the back of the spinal cord. So in the white matter is where our myelinated axons are going up to other spinal levels, perhaps extending up all the way to the brain. And this is also where the brain is going to be projecting myelinated axons down to different spinal levels. Now that should about sum up the anatomy of the spinal cord itself, but there's some other structures that we also need to note. So I'm going to actually direct you all to this picture so that we can see what other structures that we have. At each level of the spinal cord, we're going to project out a pair of spinal nerves on either side. The spinal nerves are shown right here, and they will traverse across the entire body. We saw spinal nerves in the first picture that I showed you of this presentation. But these spinal nerves just don't simply project out of the side of the spinal cord, they actually will separate into two different roots. So I'll mention again that all spinal nerves carry both sensory and motor information. The blue arrows depict sensory information coming in to the spinal cord, and the red arrows depict motor information leaving the spinal cord. So you can see the spinal cord is actually going to separate into two different roots. We have an anterior root up here, and then we'll have a posterior root that can be found back here. Now we can also call the anterior root the ventral root, and this is often called the ventral root, so I'd like you to feel comfortable with both words in this example. And we can also call the posterior root the dorsal root. So that's another distinction that I'd like you to be comfortable with. This can either be called the posterior root or the dorsal root. Now the dorsal or the posterior root is only going to contain the axons of sensory neurons that are bringing sensory information into the spinal cord, and the ventral or anterior root is only going to contain the axons of motor neurons that are projecting their axons out to different effectors that can be found in the body. So while the spinal nerves themselves will actually carry both sensory and motor information, the sensory information separates into the dorsal root, and the motor information is going to be found in the anterior root. Now there's one other structure that I'd like you to be familiar with on the dorsal root, and that is this large bulbous structure that's found coming off of the dorsal root. This is referred to as the dorsal root ganglion. And a ganglion is just an area of gray matter that's found in the peripheral nervous system, which refers to a collection of neuronal cell bodies. So the dorsal root ganglion is where we're going to find the cell bodies of many sensory neurons. So when sensory information comes in from our spinal nerves, it's going to separate, go into the dorsal root ganglion. These neurons are going to send signals back into the posterior gray horn, and then this information is going to travel all the way around to the anterior gray horn, where that motor information can travel out the anterior or ventral root back out the spinal nerve. One of the other structures that we see playing a major role in reflex arcs is going to be the interneuron that's synapsing with both a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. So interneurons and motor neurons tend to be multipolar neurons, and sensory neurons tend to be unipolar, which means that their dendrites are going to funnel sensory information into the cell body, and that output is going to leave through the axon through the same projection. These sensory neurons will synapse on an interneuron that will connect the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. And the interneuron is what's actually making the decision for how to deal with that sensory information. The interneuron takes the sensory information, integrates it, and sends a signal out to the motor neuron telling that motor neuron how to fire and what muscles to contract. So this is the internal anatomy of the spinal cord. I'd like you to feel very, very comfortable with this information for the test. I'd like you to be familiar with where we find sensory and motor information. And I'd also like you to be aware that if one of these regions is damaged, that's going to disrupt the function of that particular neuron. So if the ventral root is damaged right here, sensory information is still going to be able to make it back to the spinal cord through our sensory neuron, and that information might make it even to the interneuron. However, when that interneuron tells the motor neuron to fire out signals, the motor neuron's not going to be able to send that signal because the anterior root is damaged. So this is one of the big topics for Chapter 13. I'd like you to feel very, very comfortable with the information presented on this slide. So as we just discussed, the gray matter is going to be neuronal cell bodies. Those cell bodies are receiving information and deciding what to do with that information and then sending outputs to relay that information to other neurons. And our white matter tracts are made up of myelinated axons. So these are going to take nerve impulses to and from the brain. So just being aware of what gray matter and white matter refer to, that gives you a lot of information about how those two parts of the spinal cord are going to act. So the spinal cord is playing a major role in maintaining our body's homeostasis by providing us reflexes. And we're about to get into reflexes, but by offering a shortcut from our sensory neurons to our motor neurons, this allows us to send information out to our motor neurons and respond to stimuli very, very quickly. And ultimately, that's going to help us maintain our body's homeostasis. So to sum up all of our internal spinal cord anatomy, as well as the function of how these nerves are going to run, where these nerves can be found, and how they're going to work, we can see all of that information compiled on this slide. So there's a couple different components here, so we're going to take some time to go over each of these. Now the skin is going to contain many different sensory receptors. And we'll learn about some of these specific sensory receptors when we get to Chapter 16. However, there's many different sensors in the skin for touch, temperature, pain, and so forth. And all of these receptors are monitoring their respective sense. So let's use touch as an example. When something touches our skin, it's going to push our skin inward, and it's going to deform the skin in that particular place. That is a type of mechanical stimuli, so whenever we have that mechanical stimuli present, that's going to get picked up by different sensory receptors. Those sensory receptors are found on the dendrites of our sensory neurons, and they're going to send information up the dendrites into the neuronal cell body, which is found in the dorsal root ganglion. These are unipolar neurons. Remember, our sensory neurons are unipolar. You can see this sensory information is traveling all into the dorsal root ganglion and into the spinal cord through the dorsal root. And only sensory information is going to be found in the dorsal root or the dorsal root ganglion. So you can see once these sensory axons are synapsing inside the spinal cord, there's a few different places that they can go. One example is the sensory neuron that's synapsing with an interneuron. And the interneuron is going to connect a sensory neuron with a motor neuron. So this interneuron is going to help to integrate that signal, and this interneuron is going to link these two cells. So this motor neuron is going to get that signal from the interneuron telling it what to do, and then that motor neuron is going to send its signal out to the different effectors, which perhaps might be skeletal muscles, cardiac muscles, or smooth muscles. So that's just one example of a pathway that we can find in the spinal cord. But there's other pathways that we can see as well. We can actually see certain neurons coming in, synapsing with other neurons that are going to travel across the spinal cord and into one of the white columns. Once in the white column, this information can ascend and perhaps go to other spinal levels or perhaps even up to the brain. Now, we don't necessarily have to cross through the spinal cord every single time. Certain axons can come in and eventually enter into the posterior white column, and those can ascend up to the brain as well. You can see that right here we have a descending tract, which is motor information coming down from the brain in the white columns, and then that's going to perhaps synapse on the motor neurons as well. So this would be a tract that we would use, for example, if we wanted to tell our muscles to contract. If you wanted to do a particular muscle action and your brain was telling your muscles to contract in a particular way, that's what we're going to see taking place in this tract. So this picture just serves as a way to show you all the different types of arrangements that we can see in our spinal cord tracts. So this slide just serves as an example to show you how many different arrangements that we can find in our neuronal tracts. There's lots of places that these sensory neurons can go once they've entered into the spinal cord, and there's lots of different neurons that are synapsing on many other different neurons found within the spinal cord. But the main idea that I want you to understand is that sensory receptors on our sensory neurons are going to take that information in through the dorsal root ganglion in the dorsal root, and all of that sensory information is going to enter the spinal cord through the dorsal gray horn. And from there we can go in many different places. And the other major concept that I want you to understand is that the motor neuron is going to be leaving through the anterior gray horn and entering into the ventral root. And this motor information can travel out into the spinal cord and eventually make it all the way to the effectors, which can be our muscles and our glands. So there are a total of 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which means that there are individually 62 spinal nerves that are found branching from the spinal cord. And each of these spinal nerve pairs will project at the spinal cord from a different level. Each spinal nerve pair will project between vertebrae, and so these pairs of spinal nerves are often named similarly to the vertebrae. We have 8 different pairs of cervical spinal nerves, we have 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves, 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves, and 5 pairs of sacral nerves. So in order to remember the number of pairs of each of these, we can remember that there were 12 thoracic vertebrae and 5 lumbar vertebrae, so these just have the same numbers. Now there were 7 cervical vertebrae, and we're just going to add 1 for our cervical spinal nerves. And in terms of the sacral spinal nerves, there are going to be 5 pairs of these because the sacrum is 5 fused sacral vertebrae. So just keep in mind that every spinal nerve is going to carry both sensory and motor information, and it's going to separate into the anterior and the posterior roots, which will just carry sensory or motor information. The anterior and posterior roots do not carry both information, that's just the spinal nerves themselves. So this is just a bigger version of the picture that we discussed a few slides ago. This is here for your study purposes, and so that you have a bigger version of this picture. But I also post this here to really hit home how important the structure of the spinal cord is. So I'd like you to feel comfortable with the specific structures that I discussed on this picture. So in short, spinal nerves are just big bundles of myelinated axons. That's all our spinal nerves really are. Some of those axons belong to sensory neurons, and some of those axons belong to motor neurons. But within our spinal nerves, we're going to find some specialized connective tissue coverings. So each spinal nerve is wrapped in a layer of connective tissue known as epineurium. This is the outer layer of connective tissue that wraps around the entire spinal nerve. Now as we dig in deeper, we'll find separated bundles known as fascicles, and I'm sure you guys can see by now where I am going with this. Fascicles are going to be wrapped in perineurium, and each fascicle is made up of individual myelinated axons. So this is very, very similar to what we saw in muscles with our muscle fibers. Spinal nerves are just big bundles of myelinated axons. Each axon gets its own endoneurium. Each fascicle or bundle of axon is going to get their perineurium wrapped around them, and around the entire spinal nerve we'll see epineurium. So that's going to take us into the dermatomes. Now we don't really use the dermatomes very often, but it's important that we can see which spinal nerves are supplying which parts of our bodies. So the dermatomes refer to the areas of our skin that are supplied by different spinal nerves. And you can see these in the map on the right. Now, I'm not going to ask you to draw this map out on your test. I just put this picture here so that you can see the dermatomes, but I just want you to understand what dermatomes are. So the dermatomes are showing us different areas of our skin that are supplied by different spinal nerves. So spinal nerve L1 is the spinal nerve that brings in sensory information from this part of the skin. Spinal nerve C4 is going to bring sensory information from this part of the shoulder. So again, I just want you to feel comfortable with what dermatomes are. I'm not going to make you draw out the map, and I'm not going to ask you any questions about which parts of the bodies each of these spinal nerves refer to. Just be comfortable with what dermatomes are and what their significance is. Now that will take us into the 4 spinal nerve plexi. A spinal nerve plexus is just an irregular collection of nerves that are attaching to each other in various places. I'll show you some pictures of each of these nerve plexi, but I'm just going to introduce the 4 types first. We have the cervical plexus, which will be found up in the cervical region. We'll find the brachial plexus, which is one of the most common that we learn. This is going to be found just below the cervical plexus and projecting all of the nerves that we will find in our arms. The lumbar plexus will be found in the lumbar region, and the sacral plexus is going to be found just below that. Oftentimes we refer to both of these nerve plexi as the lumbosacral plexus as one. But we're going to separate these into two different nerve plexi so that we can see the differences between the two. So you can see in this picture that the cervical plexus is projecting from our cervical spinal nerves. It's formed by our different cervical spinal nerves. Specifically, the cervical plexus is formed by the roots of spinal nerves C1 through C4 and a little bit of C5 as well. So you can see that the cervical plexus is this projection of nerves, and they're sort of connecting to each other and forming this network of nervous tissue. This is quite beneficial because this gives more than one pathway that sensory or motor information can enter or leave the spinal cord. So the cervical plexus found up in the neck is going to be supplying the muscles of the neck, and it's also going to be bringing sensory information in from the neck as well. We'll see some of the lower spinal nerves innervating and supplying the upper shoulders and such, but the brachial plexus is going to be the major plexus that supplies the shoulders. One of the other important things that I want to note about the cervical plexus is that it's going to project the phrenic nerve. And the phrenic nerve is the special nerve that innervates the diaphragm, which is our muscle of breathing. So based on its location, we can infer that the neck muscles and the skin of the neck are going to be supplied by the cervical plexus. And I want you to know specifically which nerve roots are going to project and form this cervical plexus. The brachial plexus is one of the more common nerve plexi that we learn in the academic environment. You can see the brachial plexus is shown right here below the cervical plexus, and this is actually going to be projecting through the shoulder and out into the arm. So with the exception of the cervical plexus supplying the upper shoulders, the brachial plexus is going to supply the rest of the shoulders and all of the innervation to the upper limbs as well. So you can see that this nerve plexus is formed from the spinal nerve roots of C5 through T1. 5 spinal nerves make up the brachial plexus. So for those of you that are planning on going to medical school, you'll have to understand each of these different roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and branches. And you'll have to be able to draw out this brachial plexus as well. So those of you that plan to go on to medical school and be doctors, I wish you well with learning the brachial plexus. But for this class, all I want you to understand are a few of the different nerves that are projecting at the end. These 3 nerves that are originating from the brachial plexus are the median nerve, the ulnar nerve, and the radial nerve. And we can see the median nerve is actually what's going to be shown right here. We'll see the radial nerve branching off back here, and we'll see the ulnar nerve branching off back here. The ulnar nerve is the nerve that actually courses next to the olecranon process, and when we hit the ulnar nerve, that's what's often referred to as the funny bone. And the median nerve is actually what's going to run through our wrist, and is often the nerve of interest when we get carpal tunnel syndrome. So again, for the brachial plexus, I don't need you to know this entire picture. I don't need you to be able to draw out this entire brachial plexus, but I want you to just understand the different roots that form the brachial plexus, and I want you to understand the different nerves that are branching from the brachial plexus. Next up is the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus is formed by the roots of spinal nerves L1 through L4. The lumbar plexus is giving rise to 3 very special nerves. Those are the ilioinguinal nerve, the femoral nerve, and the obturator nerve. And you can see each of these shown right here. This is the ilioinguinal nerve, we see the femoral nerve right here, and we've got the obturator nerve right here. So again, with our lumbar plexus, we've got a lot of different roots and branches and such, but I just want you to feel comfortable with the different nerve roots and the different nerves that are coming from our lumbar plexus. Lastly is the sacral plexus, which is going to be formed by the spinal nerve roots of L4 to S4. Again, sometimes we'll often merge the lumbar plexus with the sacral plexus and call it the lumbosacral plexus. However, I find these to be a little easier learned when we separate them and look at them separately. Now, the one major fact that I'd like you to be comfortable with the sacral plexus is that the sacral plexus is going to project the sciatic nerve, which is a very, very large nerve that will project down the leg. We will have a coccygeal plexus as well, but I will not be testing you on the coccygeal plexus. So you just need to be familiar with the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexi. So the spinal cord is our major reflex center. And that's one of our major functions of the spinal cord, is to provide our body reflexes. Reflexes are involuntary, very, very quick responses to certain sensory stimuli that comes in and affects our bodies. Reflexes can be used medically to assess the function of certain patients, and they also serve our body in a protective function to help maintain homeostasis. There are many reflexes that our body exhibits that serve the function of protecting us from particular stimuli that's coming in. And we're going to learn some of these specific reflexes in just a minute. But first, we're going to cover the general components of a reflex arc. All reflex arcs have these same general components. They will all have sensory receptors, sensory neurons, an integrating center, a motor neuron, and effectors. These are our 5 components of reflex arcs. So the way that a reflex arc is going to work is that sensory receptors are going to sense some type of stimuli. Those sensory receptors are found on the dendrites of our sensory neurons. These sensory neurons are going to carry that sensory information up to the interneuron, which is most often going to serve as our integrating center. The interneuron is our associative neuron that's going to take that sensory stimuli and decide what bodily response needs to be exhibited in response to that sensory information. So the interneuron is going to synapse with the motor neuron, which will eventually tell the effectors what to do and to allow our bodies to produce some type of response. So as we go through our specific reflexes on the next few slides, we're going to see that each reflex, while individually special, is still going to maintain each of these components of a reflex arc. So some terms that I'd briefly like to go over before we actually go over any of these reflex arcs are shown on this slide. I briefly mentioned ipsilateral and contralateral in one of the videos at the beginning of our class. When something is ipsilateral, it means that it's on the same side. So the right arm and the right leg are on the same side of the body. Contralateral means that 2 things are on opposite sides of the body. So the right arm and the left leg are contralateral to one another. We will often use these terms when talking about the spinal cord because certain nerve tracts are going to ascend or descend on one side of the body, and other nerve tracts are going to cross over the spinal cord and ascend or descend on the other side of the body, and that would be a contralateral tract. We're also going to see this concept of reciprocal innervation as we go through our reflexes. Reciprocal innervation means that an agonist group and an antagonist group are innervated together, and they are linked with one another. So when the agonist group contracts, the antagonists are going to relax. And this is going to allow for a proper muscle action to take place. And I'll explain this a little bit more as we go through each of these reflex arcs, but I just want to introduce these terms to you so that you know what I'm talking about whenever I use them when talking about these reflexes. So the first reflex that we have is the stretch reflex. It's very likely that the last time that you went into the doctor's office that you had this stretch reflex checked on yourself. So the stretch reflex can be induced by tapping on the patellar tendon of the patient. I personally really like the stretch reflex because we can actually exhibit this on ourselves. If you tap with just the right amount of force, you can actually exhibit this stretch reflex in yourself by tapping on the patellar tendon that's found right here. Now the stretch reflex is a protective reflex that our bodies have. This reflex protects our muscle from overstretching. So what we'll see with the stretch reflex is that we're going to have muscle spindles serving as our sensory receptor. Muscle spindles are just receptors that sense stretch of muscles. These muscle spindles sensing stretch are going to send information up sensory neurons, which is our second component of our reflex arc. You can see the sensory information is entering into the spinal cord through the dorsal root, and it's actually going to branch into 3 different places. This first axon collateral is going to travel all the way up to the brain, of course, so that we can understand that we've been tapped on the patellar tendon. However, there's 2 other pathways that the sensory neuron is going to take. You can see that one pathway is going to take this sensory neuron and synapse with a motor neuron. And this motor neuron is going to innervate the group of muscles known as the quadriceps. The quadriceps is the group of muscles found on the anterior side of the leg, and the hamstrings are the group of muscles that can be found on the posterior side of the leg. And we're going to be talking about each of these groups through each of these reflexes. So this axon collateral is going to come out here and synapse with a motor neuron that innervates the quadriceps muscles. And so when this muscle spindle senses stretch, it's going to send a signal into the sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron is going to immediately tell the motor neuron to contract. This is going to excite our motor neuron to cause our quadriceps group to contract. And that's why when we tap on the patellar tendon, that's going to cause our leg to kick out in this direction. We're going to move our leg in this direction when we tap on the patellar tendon and exhibit this reflex. Now, I also mentioned in the last slide about the concept of reciprocal innervation, which just refers to the antagonist group of muscles being inhibited during a particular reflex. So the concept of reciprocal innervation is shown right here, where this axon collateral is going to come out and actually synapse with an inhibitory interneuron. Now this inhibitory interneuron, when excited, is actually going to inhibit this group of muscles known as the hamstring. So when this inhibitory neuron is excited, its action is to inhibit a group of muscles, and that's why we call it an inhibitory interneuron. So when we tap on the patellar tendon, that's going to push the tendon inwards and cause a muscle stretch. That muscle stretch is being sensed by this muscle spindle, and that information is being taken back to the spinal cord through sensory neurons. The sensory neuron is going to send its information into several different places, but the first is going to go up here to this motor neuron. This motor neuron is going to activate the quadriceps group of muscles to contract the quadriceps, and that's going to prevent the additional stretch of the quadriceps group. And at the same time, we have the reciprocal innervation where we're going to actually inhibit the contraction of our hamstring groups, which are the antagonist muscles. So this is the stretch reflex. This reflex protects our muscles from stretching too much. Now this next reflex is the tendon reflex. So this tendon reflex is actually going to also serve a protective function by protecting the tendon from overstretching. And we do this by relaxing the group of muscles that are attached to that tendon. So you can see that certain sensory receptors are going to be found in the patellar tendon in this example as well. This information is going to get sent up a sensory neuron and into the spinal cord through the posterior root. You can see that we're going to send some of these signals up to the brain so that we can actually be aware that this reflex is taking place. But we have a few different pathways that are taking place here as well. You can see that we're going to have both an excitatory interneuron and an inhibitory interneuron. So this sensory neuron is going to excite each of these interneurons. The excitatory interneuron is then in turn going to excite the motor neuron that reaches out and innervates the hamstring group. While at the same time, our inhibitory interneuron is actually going to prevent the contraction of our quadriceps group. So in this example, let's say we're trying to lift something very, very heavy. If we're stretching our tendon so much that it's potentially dangerous to our leg, and we're at risk of tearing this tendon, sensory neurons are going to take information to these interneurons to actually relax this quadriceps group and contract the hamstring group. So by relaxing the quadriceps group that's attached to the patellar tendon, that's going to prevent the additional stretching of this tendon. And this action will also be aided by the fact that we're actually contracting our antagonist hamstring group of muscles here as well. Now we have two more reflexes that we're going to discuss, but we'll actually see both of these reflexes working together. So I'm going to discuss the first part of this reflex, which is the flexor withdrawal reflex, and then on the next slide I will combine the flexor withdrawal reflex with what's known as the crossed extensor reflex. And we'll see that both of these reflexes happen at the same time. But first I'm going to go over what happens with the flexor withdrawal reflex. So the flexor withdrawal is another protective reflex that we have to protect our body from injury or pain. So in the flexor withdrawal reflex, you can see that our sensory receptors are picking up the information that we've stepped on some type of tack. So you can imagine as you're walking through your house, you might step on something sharp with your right foot. That's going to get sensed by sensory receptors and be sent up through sensory neurons into the spinal cord. And there's two major pathways that this information is going to take when it enters into the spinal cord. The first place that this information is going to go is to an excitatory interneuron that's actually going to reach different spinal nerve levels. So you can see that this excitatory interneuron is actually going to ascend and descend to different spinal nerve levels. And at each of these levels, we're going to excite an additional excitatory interneuron, which will in turn excite motor neurons. And this is going to cause the contraction of our hamstring group. We call this the flexor withdrawal reflex because we're actually contracting our flexor muscles and withdrawing our leg. Now the second place that this goes is to an additional excitatory interneuron that's going to stimulate a motor neuron that will also help to contract the hamstring group. So the hamstring group in general is going to be supplied by different spinal nerve levels. And that's why this information goes to different nerve levels so we can contract all of the parts of this muscle. So if we're walking through our house and we step on something sharp with our right leg, the response is going to be to contract and pull that right leg away. So we're actually going to contract the hamstring group of muscles that's found on the posterior side of the leg. So this is the flexor withdrawal reflex. Now on this slide, we're going to introduce the crossed extensor reflex. Now, I know that this picture looks very involved, but I want you to be aware that this on the left side of the picture is the flexor withdrawal reflex. We've already actually learned the entire left side of this picture on the previous slide. So we're just adding these other nerve tracts that take themselves over to the other side of the spinal cord as well. And this is showing us the crossed extensor reflex. So I like to think of both of these reflexes that happen at the same time every time we step on something sharp. So when we step on something sharp with our right leg, that's going to be sensed by different sensory receptors in the right foot. That information is going to get taken up the sensory neuron and enter into the spinal cord through the posterior root. This sensory neuron is going to synapse with different excitatory interneurons at different levels of the spinal cord to send excitatory contraction signals out to the hamstring group to pull our right leg away. This is the flexor withdrawal reflex. But at the same time that the flexor withdrawal reflex is taking place, other excitatory interneurons are actually going to travel contralaterally, which means that they're going to go to the opposite side of the spinal cord. And these are going to travel to different levels of the spinal cord as well. You can see that at the same level, we're going to synapse with a motor neuron right here. You can see that up here, we'll synapse with a motor neuron here. And down at this level, we'll also be synapsing with another motor neuron. All of these motor neurons are innervating the quadriceps muscles. However, these quadriceps are on the left leg. So the crossed extensor reflex refers to a reflex that occurs in the left leg when we've stepped on a tack with the right leg. So with the flexor withdrawal reflex, we stepped on a tack with our right foot and we contract our hamstring group to pull our leg away. But we also have to maintain balance, otherwise we might fall down and fall on that tack. So this is where the crossed extensor reflex comes in. At the same time that we're contracting the hamstring group of our right leg, we're contracting the quadriceps group of our left leg, which will extend our left leg and help us to maintain balance as we're pulling our right leg away from the tack. So all of these actions occur from stepping on a tack and getting that information from sensory receptors to a sensory neuron and bringing that information up to interneurons that will either go ipsilaterally or contralaterally. You can see that these excitatory interneurons are going to travel contralaterally to the other side of the spinal cord, and these excitatory interneurons are going to stay ipsilateral. So the flexor withdrawal crossed extensor reflex is another reflex that provides our body protection and helps us to maintain homeostasis. When we step on a tack, that can potentially damage our tissue on the bottom of our foot. So it's important that we can remove ourselves from that situation as quickly as possible to minimize any damage that might occur. So reflexes in general is one of the major functions of our spinal cord, and that helps us to maintain our body's homeostasis. The flexor withdrawal crossed extensor reflex will conclude Chapter 13, and I'll see you all in the next video at Chapter 14 when we will discuss the brain.